Welcome back to this sixth session of the Biblical Orchard, where the fruit of the Spirit grows. I titled this session, Zacchaeus and the Fruit of Generous Goodness. But I have to be honest, that title is a kind of compromise, if not a cop-out, due to a translation issue. Some English Bibles translate this fruit of the Spirit as generosity. But more commonly, it's translated as goodness. Now, the Greek word that Paul used is agathosune. It's based on the word agathos, which just means good. The woman's name Agatha is just a feminized form of agathos. So clearly the word is based off the idea of goodness. But for some reason, scholars suspect that it works differently here in the list of the fruit of the Spirit. My small Greek dictionary defines agathosune as goodness, perhaps generosity. But my big standard Greek dictionary lists every use of agathosune in the New Testament. And every other citation, it's defined as goodness. But for Galatians 5:22, it says generosity instead, with no alternative or other possibility. I honestly don't know why agathosune is given this different meaning in this particular verse. But it raises the question, did St. Paul mean goodness, or did he mean generosity as one fruit of the Spirit? Well, very likely Greek speakers would have heard both shades of meaning in this particular word. And even in English, the two concepts are closely related. But I do think we may sometimes hear goodness in terms of our own morality or behavior. But agathosune sees goodness more in terms of how we treat others. It's goodness directed outside of ourselves, towards our neighbors. So, generous goodness is just my attempt to capture both sides of that word and both shades of meaning that it contains. But in any case, however you define the word, the Bible has a great illustration of how goodness and generosity combine. In Luke 19, Jesus was on the last leg of his final journey to Jerusalem. He knew and had warned his disciples that he would suffer there and be executed on the cross. But even as he was focused on going to Jerusalem, Jesus was still doing ministry, still calling people to repent and to believe in him. And one person whom Jesus still had to call was Zacchaeus. Now, when you hear the name Zacchaeus, what comes immediately to mind? I would guess that you think that he was short and he climbed a tree to see Jesus. That was reinforced by the old Sunday school song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up into a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. And those are, of course, both colorful details of the story, but the heart of it lies elsewhere. Luke assumed that his readers would know the significance of Zacchaeus' situation, but we don't necessarily anymore. Luke described him as being a chief tax collector and rich. And those two descriptors have significant implications. Being a chief tax collector meant that Zacchaeus worked for the enemy, for the oppressor of the Jews. And yet, at the end of this text, Jesus referred to Zacchaeus as also being a son of Abraham. That means Zacchaeus himself was Jewish, and therefore a traitor to his own people by collecting taxes for the enemy. But to note that he was rich suggests that he was also a crook. We know that Roman tax policy at that time just invited fraud. The Romans would simply set minimum amounts that the tax collectors had to turn in. Anything they could get above that was gravy. And so they became very adept at excising a tax on each wheel of a cart and each hoof of a donkey, and very often became filthy rich doing it. And it seems that Zacchaeus himself was an expert at that kind of exploitation. Now, the fact that Zacchaeus was short and that he had this particular job may suggest that he had a bit of a Napoleon complex. That is, that he felt he needed to prove himself and to show that he was better than others. And that might explain his difficulty in seeing Jesus. Luke says he couldn't see Jesus on account of the crowd. And it seems entirely possible that they all stood shoulder to shoulder to make absolutely sure that the dirty little runt couldn't see through to what he wanted. And so Zacchaeus was reduced to climbing a tree. And that Sunday school song sort of suggests that this was cute or sweet, but it was not in a first century context. It was humiliating. The only people who climbed trees were children and slaves. Certainly not someone of Zacchaeus' stature. Plus, the sycamore tree was considered unclean under the law. It's because of the way that the birds gathered in it. It's kind of a nice poetic touch that Zacchaeus, the crooked traitor, tax collector, is caught up in an unclean tree. But the sycamore also had big, lush leaves, and so it was a good tree to hide in. And it seems clear that Zacchaeus intended to hide in that tree. He wanted to see Jesus, but he almost surely didn't want to be seen by Jesus. And so as we read this text, and Jesus comes and stops below the tree and looks up and calls Zacchaeus by name, that was a total disaster. I mean, can't you just imagine how the crowd laughed and roared and ridiculed little Zacchaeus when Jesus spotted him up in that tree? I mean, Luke says that he hurried down to meet Jesus, but that would have been the equivalent of what today we call a walk of shame. But it's also important to see that the crowd would have considered this also to be a disaster, a walk of shame for Jesus. In verse 7, Luke says, all who saw it began to grumble and said, he, Jesus, has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Now, that's not just sour grapes because Jesus chose someone that they all hated. Here, sinner means someone who is not complying with the law of Moses. And clearly, Zacchaeus was not. And so to go to his house to eat with him would have rendered Jesus also unclean under the law, out of compliance. And so both Zacchaeus and Jesus took an enormous risk here as they headed off to Zacchaeus' home for dinner. But despite all of the scandal and the ridicule and the humiliation of the situation, Zacchaeus did in fact hurry down from the tree. And Luke says was happy to welcome Jesus. Why was he so willing? What made all the embarrassment worth it? Well, Jesus said something very significant to him that again is kind of easy for us to miss. In verse 5, as Jesus looked up into the tree, he said, Zacchaeus, hurry down. I must stay at your house today. Now that word must is just a little word in Greek, dei. But what it indicates is divine necessity. That this is something God himself has decreed must happen. And so Jesus walking by and finding Zacchaeus in that tree was no chance encounter. This was a central reason why Jesus came through Jericho. And likewise, Zacchaeus was more than just honored to host a famous guest in his home and kind of stick a thumb in the eye of all his critics in town. Rather, he had heard amidst the crowd's ridicule and hatred that Jesus had come for him. And that made this encounter a matter of salvation, not just conversation or hospitality. And that's really the only explanation for Zacchaeus' sudden, complete transformation. With no recorded prompting from Jesus, he simply turned his life inside out. Verse 8 says, Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Well, that repentant commitment went far beyond what was required or expected. The usual standard of really generous giving was about 20%, not 50%. And when Zacchaeus said, "If I have defrauded anyone," that's what's called a condition of reality. It wasn't an open question whether he had. What it really meant was, to the extent that I have defrauded anyone. But here again, the normal restitution would have been twofold, not fourfold. But in the law of Moses, it did stipulate that someone who had rustled sheep or cattle from a neighbor had to restore 4 animals in return. And so by promising a fourfold restitution, Zacchaeus implicitly equated himself with a common thief. Well, here you can tell Zacchaeus was not just trying to cover up or atone for his sins through excess generosity. We occasionally see criminal types who have done that, to salve their consciences or to fool people. But Zacchaeus' commitment shows that he wasn't trying to impress Jesus. Rather, he was changed, transformed into a new person by Jesus' call to him and by Jesus' love for him. So the generous goodness that just flowed now out of Zacchaeus to the people he had cheated or defrauded was the fruit of the Spirit. It was not so much Zacchaeus' offering to God as it was what God generated within him and drew out of him. And so at the end of the text, Jesus noted, "Mission accomplished. I came to seek out and to save the lost." And he had done exactly that for Zacchaeus. And so little Zacchaeus is the model of true, generous goodness toward others. He shows that if that kind of generosity and goodness is forced or obligatory or done to get some reward, well, it automatically loses a lot of its luster. But when God pulls it out of us in response to his generous goodness to us, then it's authentic and genuine. Then, just as with Zacchaeus, it becomes unforced, unconscious, joyful, an opportunity, not a duty. Indeed, Zacchaeus perfectly reflects Jesus' own words in John 13, where he said, "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Well, now enjoy some good conversation together around the fruit of generous goodness. And we'll see you next time.